we got just a couple minutes before I start. Anything to chat about before that?
Did your son get his job?
Oh, I'm not sure yet. I think so because they called him yesterday and they asked. He hadn't signed his Social Security card before, and they scanned it when he was there, and then they called him and said, "Hey, we need you to sign it and bring it back in." So that's a good sign, and it seems like they're interested in hiring. So I hope so. Yeah, thank you. That would be a good thing. Good thing. Too late, I'm already starting. No, go ahead.
Yep. Have you heard the term, which I'm sure you have, deism?
What is it?
Deism?
Deism, yeah. So deism was something that was fairly popular like in the 1700s. So it's a belief that there is an all-powerful God, but he's sort of the watchmaker God. He kind of set it up to run according to natural law, and then just kind of his hands off and let it go. And so he doesn't really interfere. There are some deists who think, yeah, he would interfere or intervene every once in a while, but for the most part, it's just hands off. That way you can, in a sense, it's sort of like blending a naturalistic worldview with Christianity, with theism. I believe that there's the biblical God. Because then you can say, yeah, I believe God exists, but he doesn't really do anything to this world, so you can live kind of as a practical atheist. You don't have to account for miracles and all that kind of stuff. It just is. And so it was something that became popular in the 1600s, 1700s. There's still some today. But.
Would deism be similar to people that say the universe, or instead of saying, having maybe Christian influence or whatever, they would say praying to the universe, or it's all about the universe?
There might be some similarities, but I think a lot of times the deists would be comfortable saying that they believe in God. Because they want to play that side of the field too, so they're not ashamed to say that they believe that God exists, but they just, for whatever reason, don't. It's strange because if he's powerful enough to make everything, you think he can certainly intervene or interact with the world, but that he just chooses not to for some reason. Yeah, it's a strange compromise with naturalism. So, yeah, good question. All right, well, this one is probably something I'm sure you guys have heard some of these terms thrown around. Whether it's, I'll list a few of them in a bit. But I've not given this presentation before. I've read all sorts of books on this, written a bunch of papers in a doctoral class just on this topic back in January. And so I think we had to write 6 papers. Yeah, 5 different books, and then watch a bunch of videos. And so it got pretty sickening after some of the stuff. So there's, I don't know how well organized this is, let me just put it that way. But we're going to jump into it here. I like this cartoon showing CRT, critical race theory, which is something that has been going on in several schools, a lot of schools, not every school, but a lot of schools for quite a while. But it's not just in our schools, as we'll see, it's also in the church in a lot of places. So one of the problems with critical race theory is that it undermines biblical authority. It undermines the sufficiency of Scripture. It undermines the biblical view of man and woman. And it ultimately undermines the gospel. And yes, a lot of Christians are buying into this and thinking that it's just fine. We're going to see some of the problems with it tonight. Not just critical race theory, there's also critical gender theory and all sorts of other quote-unquote critical theories. And so we won't have time to get into all of them, but it's a similar idea just applied to different subjects. And you'll see why these things fail. So you may have noticed in recent times, especially the last decade or so, we've had definitions being changed all the time, or thrown up in the air to where we don't even know what they are. So marriage has been redefined in recent years. Male and female, we have Supreme Court justice that can't even define what a woman is, even though she stands for women's rights. How does that work? You don't even know who you're defending. And ultimately, obviously, she knows what a woman is, but she didn't want to say it because it's not popular to define a woman the way that a woman has always been defined since the time God made human beings, and the way every other culture defines woman. Racism has been redefined. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Justice has been redefined. And we have all sorts of new terminology that have been thrown out there in the last several decades. Many of these just in the last decade or so that a lot of you have been familiar with them. But you've got deconstructionism, that's been around longer than some of the other ones. Social justice. Sometimes these things will sound good, but the way that they use them is not good. Intersectionality, anti-racism, that sounds good, but we'll talk about that. Wokeness, critical race theory, there's critical gender theory, queer theory, colonial theory, there's all sorts of other critical theories. Decolonization, whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy, white fragility, and on and on and on. So, where this really starts, and you guys probably thought, I thought I was coming to the church tonight to get a theology lesson. How come we're talking about Marxism and Leninism? Well, because that's the root of all of these things. And so we're going to do a little tiny bit of history here before we get into some of these other ones. So even though most of us have only recognized some of these things in the last 10 years or so, when they've really exploded on the scene, the whole movement was birthed a couple centuries ago, and it's been festering in many places. And in the last 50 years, it's really been festering on our university campuses. It is deliberately and decidedly anti-Christian, and yet there is a blind idealism to Marxism that appeals to young people, to naive college students who hear, well, wouldn't it be great if everybody gets treated the same, everybody gets the same thing? Yeah, but you don't understand the cost in order to get to that, and it never works. It never has come close to working. But essentially what it does is it boils down every single human interaction is between an oppressor and the oppressed. That's what all of these things have in common. They take that idea from Marxism and Leninism. Every human action between oppressor and oppressed. Here's Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed. Stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And that really is Marxism in a nutshell, is to classify everybody into two different camps, the oppressor and the oppressed, and you want them to ultimately you want this revolution, you want it to be a violent revolution according to Marx, and that's what Marxists have tried to do in different societies. And in the ashes, you're going to get your utopia. If you want to go back even further, they followed what's called the Hegelian dialectic, where you have the thesis, which is the current state of affairs, and this antithesis, which is the opposite idea that are going to clash, and from that, you're going to get a synthesis, and that's working toward your utopia. They go on, hitherto every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. So you'll see that language coming thrown around in our day quite a bit. So Lenin, obviously followed Marx and built upon Marx. So democracy is not identical with majority rule. Democracy is a state which recognizes the subjugation of the minority to the majority. That is an organization for the systematic use of force by one class against the other, by one part of the population against the other. Do you see how they are setting these things up? It's always just two groups, one against the other, constantly fighting. No unity, no attempt at unity. It's always just this class struggle. And he went on and said, we must crush the bourgeoisie in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be broken by force, and boy, did they ever do it. If you're familiar with Lenin. murdered millions of his own people. Over 100 million people slaughtered in the 20th century alone in Russia, China, Cambodia, and other Marxist regimes. That's roughly 30% of the United States population. It has produced violence and poverty whenever and wherever it's been implemented. There is not one successful nation that has followed Marxism. It collapses the economy, it collapses the nation. You got the USSR, which collapsed. You got Cuba, North Korea. Have you guys ever seen the satellite photo at night of North Korea versus South Korea? You want to see the difference between capitalism and Marxism? There it is. One's almost completely dark, and the other one is full and vibrant. Venezuela, China, East Germany, Ethiopia, Poland, Romania, wherever it tried, it failed miserably. So, why does it fail? Well, ultimately, that's why all economic systems, even capitalism, will ultimately fail, because people are inherently sinful. And they recognize when they're being treated unfairly. So if you're somebody who is working hard and yet you're in a Marxist system, you get paid the same as somebody who is not working hard. How long before you realize this is not fair? Why am I going to keep working really hard if I'm not going to be rewarded, and somebody else just gets rewarded for it? So your level of productivity goes down, everybody goes down. And you've probably heard so you've probably seen the example with students. You know, a lot of times students are all for Marxism and everything until you try it with their grades, and they're completely against it. You take an A student who's worked his or her tail off to earn that A, and then you have another student who's got an F in the class, and you say, you know, we're going to give you both C's. We're going to average it out. Well, that's not fair. Why? I thought you said you like Marxism. But that's what it is. And they don't like it when it comes to their own personal stuff, but they think by society at large, implementing something like that would somehow work out, and yet it never has. So I mentioned capitalism a little bit ago, and unless you think that it is 100% perfect, it's not, because it's made up of people who are not perfect. Okay? It is a far better system, because what it does is it spreads the power and the accountability up to a large number of people, to everybody, rather than just a select few. And you've heard the old dictum that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? When you have Marxists in a small group in control, then you see horrible corruption. But what Marxists will often do is they'll highlight the corporate greed that you'll see. We see that, right, in our society. We see some people who have abused, I'll say abused capitalism, and as a result, they've abused their employees, that kind of stuff, because of greed. So that kind of stuff happens, and they'll use that, and also the fact that there's poverty in our nations. They see capitalism isn't working, we got to try Marxism. Well, look at Marxist nations where everybody's in poverty. So how is that going to solve it? So all economic systems have problems because human beings are sinful, and capitalism at least encourages and rewards hard work and innovation, although because we can be greedy, that can lead to great harm as well. And that's why you can have something that's like completely free market, hands off of everything. You can have certain controls from government that that seem to be maybe seem to be good ideas, and you have other ones where it gets overbearing. And there's a lot of debate about that. I don't want to get into economics 101 tonight, but you have to understand these basics before we dive into some of these topics. So once Marxism really failed in the West originally, so it succeeded with East Germany. It succeeded in the sense of at least turning these nations over to it. The nations didn't succeed, but you got East Germany, you got USSR, you had China, these other ones that bought into it. But in the West, other than like Cuba, they really didn't, and then recently it's Venezuela. But Antonio Gramsci was an Italian thinker, and he said that, he's a Marxist, he said that it failed in the West because of the Christian heritage. He said no communist revolution would take place and no utopia could arrive in the United States or in the West unless Christianity's cultural hegemony was broken. What he means by it is that the entire culture is set up in a way that honors a Christian tradition. It doesn't mean that every single person is a Christian, but they have those underlying principles that everybody has value. The individual is important rather than just everything being about the state. because the individual is made in the image of God, therefore we put great value on them. But if you view them as just pawns of the state, then who cares? So, cultural hegemony refers to domination or rule achieved through ideological or cultural means, inferring that a group or people can have the ability to hold power over social institutions and thus influencing the everyday thought, expectations, and behavior of the rest of society by directing the normative ideas, values, and beliefs that become the dominant worldview of society. He's saying in the West, Christianity had done this. That most people throughout the West thought in terms of like a Christian worldview. And so they're not going to accept Marxism until we break that Christian worldview. That's been their goal. In the early 20th century, you had the Frankfurt School, of course in Germany, applied Marxism to radical social theories and developed critical theory as an expansion of Marxist conflict theory, that there's always these two classes conflicting, oppressor versus oppressed. They sought to address the structural issues causing inequity, and you've probably heard something like that today. So what we hear now is inequity rather than inequality. So if you don't have the same results for everybody, then it's not fair. And if everybody doesn't get the exact same amount, or they don't get the same thing, then there must be discrimination taking place. Rather than maybe they didn't try hard like somebody else did, for whatever reason. And it can't all be boiled down to just they didn't try hard. Okay, that's just one example. There are other issues that go into it. But what happened in the 1930s and following is the rise of postmodernism, which is actually like Marxism light. It's Marxism with words. It's not about violent revolution, but it's about taking over through the use of changing language and deconstructing language, redefining things. So you had a bunch of French writers, Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard, who they rejected absolute truth. Foucault attacked history. It says, you've heard this before, right? History is written by the winners. Have you heard that? Is it true? Well, a lot of times, but not always. History is not always written by the winners. And so let's say it's written by the winners, therefore you can't trust it because they obviously have a bias. Because they're going to put it themselves in the best possible light, so you can't really believe what they're writing. And it's only if you have the writing from the losing side, which of course get burned, and you won't have those writings, so you can't trust history at all. And so they despise history. But that statement itself is not even accurate. Derrida came up with this deconstruction idea where it undermines the use of language, arguing, so what we talked about the other night, that meaning is found in the mind of the recipient, not the mind of the sender, the mind of the recipient. And the goal of deconstructionism, I know we're throwing out a lot of different terms, we're going to get into stuff that you're more familiar with in just a couple minutes. The goal of deconstructionism is to identify binary concepts, dark and light, rich and poor, oppressor, oppressed. Together. Is to identify that in language and show how language has been used as a tool for oppression. So they try to identify that in every single type of communication and break it down to oppressor versus oppressed. So, the Christian writer said this, and look at when this was, 1994. He saw it coming. Okay, nearly 30 years ago. Post-Marxist radicalism constructs new revolutionary ideologies by replacing Marxist concern for the oppressed working class with other oppressed groups, blacks, women, gays. Status and moral legitimacy come from being excluded from power. The victim has the favored role. Are we seeing that in our day? Okay, this is exactly what we're seeing popularized in our culture. So where Marxism emphasized economics, everything about socioeconomic issues, postmodernism focused on literature and history, but they both promote the alleged oppressor versus oppressed paradigm, and they set the stage for all these different critical theories that are going on in our world today. Huckrow and Lindsay, they have a really good book called Cynical Theories, and they're not Christian writers, but the book is outstanding if you want to get a good idea of what's going on with these different views. They said that although many experts consider postmodernism to have ended in the 1990s, the truth is that it morphed into the various theories prominent in today's world. And it, quote, simply mutated from its earlier high deconstructive phase into a new form, a diverse set of highly politicized and actionable theories developed out of postmodernism proper, which is what we're going to get into in just a moment. But we do want to talk about the Bible, right? You get bored with all the Marx, we're done talking about the past history stuff. Now we're going to look at the stuff going on in our world today, but we're going to look at first the biblical view on this. What is it? Well, the Bible tells us in Acts 17:26, Paul is preaching there, it says he has made from one, some of our Bibles fill in the word blood because the word's not in Greek there, it's just he's made from one, some will say one man. Every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times in the boundaries of their dwelling. We all go back to Adam. Okay, meaning we are all the same race. Okay? And after that, we all go back to Noah and his family. So every single human being on this planet goes back to Noah and his family. We're all one blood, one race. From a biblical perspective, there's no basis for racism. Eve is the mother of all living, is what it says in Genesis 3:20. And we see in John 3:16 the solution, because we've all sinned against God, right? And so we all need a Savior. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Christ died for all, not just for people who look a certain way. Okay, he became one of us and died on the cross for our sins. When I say one of us, I'm not talking about people who look like me or have the same skin shape. Like human being. That's what he became. So the biblical view, here it is illustrated. Start with Adam and Eve. They had sons and daughters, and then eventually you get to the time of the flood. You've got Noah and his sons and their wives. And then at Babel, you get people split up according to their languages, and that's where you get the rise of these different people groups, what eventually a lot of people would define as races, but they're just really different people groups with certain characteristics. The fact is, we all have the exact same skin color. We have the same pigment. Some people just have more or less of it. Okay? So, from a biblical perspective, no basis for racism. And yet what we see in our culture today is it's all about race. So, I don't even like using the term race in that way, because we're truly just one blood. But for the sake of using the terminology that's being used today, then we're going to talk about CRT, critical race theory, which really has been redefining racism itself. So you guys have probably seen some of these headlines. Coca-Cola holds anti-racist training that instructs employees to be less white, according to whistleblower with receipts. So you got to be less white, be less oppressive, be less arrogant, be less certain, be less defensive. So if you're offended by that and you act defensively, you're acting white. Stop doing that. So I can call you a racist, and if you get upset with that, you're acting white. You're showing that you're a racist. They put you in an indefensible position. No matter how you respond, you're a racist. And that's a loaded question. Walmart to workers, you're a racist. Training program claims U.S. a white supremacy system. Did that surprise you about 5 years ago, where suddenly this all jumped on the stage? Everything about white supremacy, and you're like, oh, I've been a white person in this country for a long time. I've never met a white supremacist. Now, are there few and far between? Are there some people who might don the white hood and everything and actually be white supremacists? Yeah, there are some of those. I'm not trying to discount that there are real racists out there. But to just say every single person is white is a white supremacist? What do we call it when, or what do we used to at least call it when you judge somebody by the color of their skin? Remember we had a term that, it was called racism. But now that's not what racism is anymore. Because only one group of people can be racist, those who are in power. Pope Francis compares Black Lives Matter protests to Good Samaritan. Yeah, you remember when the Good Samaritan helped the guy out and then he went and torched a bunch of cities and burned down a building? I don't remember reading that either. The Bible talks about slavery, so why are conservative Christians so afraid of critical race theory? Because critical race theory is not about slavery. It's not that we're afraid of it, but this is a common tactic. We'll hear all the time in the media that they're not teaching critical race theory in schools. Well, how can they get so offended when it's banned by certain states, when they pass laws to ban critical race theory? If they're not teaching, why are you upset about it? Because they are teaching it. And then they'll get on the news and say, you just don't want to learn about history. It's not about learning about history. We're all for learning about history. But what we don't want is that you're telling somebody that just based on the color of their skin, they're a racist. And all sorts of other things. Because That's what used to be called racism. When you're judging somebody based on the color of their skin. Critical race theory battle invades school boards with help from conservative groups. In towns nationwide, well-connected conservative activists and Fox News have ramped up the tension and fights over race and equity in schools. It's not about race and equity. It's about teaching a theory that pits people against each other constantly, rather than teaching them the truth, and that is that we're all one. Critical race theory, top issue in Virginia election. Democrats still insist it isn't real, and yet there was the person who ran against critical race theory, Youngkin, won as governor, and was quite a surprise. A lot of people didn't think that he would do very well, and yet that was because you had like a Loudon School Board in Virginia where they were teaching all kinds of stuff that you've seen in the news, and parents were at school board meetings and were very upset at the stuff that their kids were being taught. And you have teachers and school board people who tell them they have no business over what's being taught there. How would that make you feel as a parent? Because from a Marxist point of view, you have no rights as a parent. The child does not belong to you, the child belongs to the state. That's the Marxist worldview. And that's what these people believe. So where did CRT come from, critical race theory? Derek Bell is considered to be the father of CRT. He's the first tenured African American at Harvard Law School. He wrote a book called Racism Without Racists. Because what they'll say with critical race theory, you may not have a racist bone in your body, but because you are white, you benefit from this system, therefore you are racist. You're participating in racism, even though you personally are not racist. He openly advocated revisionist history and claimed that America had not and would not ever make any progress in race relations. So this is a guy writing this stuff in the 1970s and then in the 1980s. Do you think the 1980s, those of you who were around in the 1980s, do you think the race relations were better in the 1980s than the 1860s? Early 1860s, when slavery was legal. Do you think it was better in the 1980s and 1990s than it was in the early 1900s in the South with Jim Crow laws? What do you think? Of course. It was far better. And if things hadn't ever gotten better, how on earth could the United States elect the first African American president back in 2008? Now, unfortunately, President Obama had an opportunity to really unite people, but he did just the opposite, because he bought into all of this stuff. As you're going to see, he really liked Derek Bell. So he said America is racist at its core, thus its legal and social structures are also racist. This must all be torn down and replaced with Marxist leadership. In 1991, Barack Obama praised Bell as one who speaks the truth and is an excellent scholar. He urged his audience to, quote, open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derek Bell. Bell opposed Clarence Thomas's nomination to the Supreme Court, even though Clarence Thomas is a black man, right? So you would think, if you're all about, that for you it would be so important to have an African American in an important position, you would think you'd support that, right? No, what is he? He says to place a person who looks black and who, in conservative terms, thinks white is an insult. How racist is that? A black person's not allowed to think differently than Derek Bell? They all have to think just like him? Don't we hear that in the media quite a bit? Anytime there's a conservative woman or a conservative black person, they are just completely attacked. Blacks are called Uncle Toms by media, and they get away with it. They're not suspended. The media people aren't suspended when they're called that or anything, but flip it around, what happened the other way? You know what happened. I'm not trying to get into a whole political discussion. Unfortunately, that's where this goes, but we're going to be looking at some theological things in a little bit. Well, Bell's successors in the 1980s, some black feminists under Lord Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, she doesn't capitalize her name. There's a few people in this movement, for whatever reason, they don't capitalize their name. Popularized critical theory among feminists. One of Bell's students, Kimberly Crenshaw, added ideas about gender and sexuality to critical theory, and that led to the concept of intersectionality. You've heard of that before, right? So it's not just about critical race theory. If you are a person of color in our culture, you are being oppressed by the white. If you are a female, you're also being oppressed by men. If you are a gay person, you're also being oppressed by straight people. Therefore, if you are a gay black woman, you are the most oppressed of anybody. That's intersectionality. You have more intersectionality points, therefore you suffer greater persecution in our culture. That's what they're talking about. So intersectionality within CRT points to the multidimensionality, that's what I was talking about, of oppressions, and recognizes that race alone cannot account for disempowerment. Intersectionality means, this is by the way UCLA School of Public Affairs, intersectionality means the examination of race, sex, class, national origin, and sexual orientation and how their combination plays out in various settings. This is an important tenet in pointing out that CRT is critical of the many oppressions facing people of color and does not allow for a one-dimensional approach of the complexities of our world. CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. The individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. You see that? You don't even have to have you don't even have to be racist to be racist. This is the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. CRT also rejects the tradition of liberalism and meritocracy. See that? Liberalism, what they're talking about is like classical liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of press. CRT doesn't want that. They don't want open and honest debate. And they don't want meritocracy, which means you get what you deserve. If you work hard, you should be rewarded for it. They don't want that either. Because they want things given. They want things, it's really all about redistribution. They want things taken from those who have and given to those who have not. Why? Because that creates conflict, and then you get that revolution that they want. Legal discourse says that the law is neutral and colorblind. However, CRT challenges this legal truth by examining liberalism and meritocracy as a vehicle for self-interest, power, and privilege. CRT also recognizes that liberalism and meritocracy are often stories heard from those with wealth, power, and privilege. These stories paint a false picture of meritocracy. Everyone who works hard can attain wealth, power, and privilege while ignoring the systemic inequalities that institutional racism provides. All right, a lot of terms that get thrown around every single day. We hear systemic all the time and a bunch of these other things. Essentially, they're just saying that the whole entire system is racist at its core, so anything you set up, even if it looks fair, it's not really fair. And therefore, the whole thing has to be torn down. So there are 8 core principles of critical race theory, and we've already covered some of these a little bit. People are identified by groups according to race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, etc., and are either an oppressor or the oppressed. I am out of luck. Okay, I am a white, straight, Christian male who happens to be tall. I am the most oppressive of anybody, okay, from their system. Intersectionality is the tool used to determine someone's group and level of oppression, because if you get a few of those boxes checked, you're more oppressed than others. Oppression is the only real sin, and only the oppressors are guilty and is systematically present. That's why, even if you have somebody who happens to be a person of color, if let's say they hate all white people, okay? Let's say that they say the most obnoxious and hateful things. They're not racist because they're not in power. They can't be racist. That's what the system believes. Any disparity in outcome between groups is the result of oppression, discrimination, and/or racism. So what they want is, they claim to want equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. Okay, fairness is giving equality of opportunity, right? And then what you do with it is up to you. And yes, sometimes people get bad breaks, and not everybody's going to always have equal opportunity. But the oppressed have an understanding of reality through their oppression that oppressors can't have. That's why we can't speak to this issue, because I'm not oppressed. So therefore, I have to just, you've heard this, take a back seat and listen. Just listen. By the way, my best friend in college bought into all of this stuff, and I no longer have a friend because he's unfriended me, will not talk to me, because I won't just listen. He wrote a book called Biblical Justice, and I asked him if he happened to have 2 Thessalonians 3, 10 through 13 in there. We'll get to that by the end. Trust me, he didn't. And I'll show you by the end what that verse said. If for some reason we don't get to it, ask me and I'll skip to the end. Anybody who disagrees with CRT are only trying to maintain oppressive power and or are deceived. So either I'm just trying to continue to oppress people, or I'm just deceived on this. Notice they already make all these excuses so that anybody who disagrees therefore is automatically racist. Nobody wants to be racist, except for people who are actually racist. The goal is a redistribution of power, privilege, authority, and resources to the oppressed. The solution is the deconstruction of a systematically oppressive society and a rebuilding of the society that leads to equity. Notice, not equality. Yes, this is what Marxism has promised all the time, and it has never, ever delivered. And what do we hear all the time whenever we point that out? Oh, well, it's just never been implemented properly. Because it can't be. It will always fail. Because it's a horrible system that is set up directly against what God has established, and therefore it will never work. Now, let me put it this way. If human beings were sinless, it would work. Because everybody would work the amount that they should, they wouldn't have any sort of envy, jealousy, that kind of stuff, and they would, if everybody's working, that sort of a system can work. And if they're being rewarded, if they're all working the same way, yeah, so then it could work, but we're not sinless. But think about this. Only in a society that is not oppressive to minority groups could minority groups claim oppression, take action against the so-called oppressor, and not get crushed. Right? If we were truly as racist of a nation as they claim, or as oppressive of a nation as they claim, how come they get to enjoy as much free speech as they want to say these things, and they've been able to do it for a long time? Because apparently we're not as oppressive as they claim, and not as evil as they claim. By the way, I'm not saying that the United States is perfect. Don't take that away from this presentation tonight. I like what Martin Luther King Jr. said. Apparently they've forgotten him. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Remember my friend that I told you about? He posted on Facebook one day, how would you define racism? And I was about to type this in, and somebody beat me to it. He deleted his post. Because that's a perfect explanation. People should be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Racism is judging by the color of the skin, but he didn't want that reminder that, oh, by the way, that was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that. Because he wanted it all to be about CRT, which doesn't care about Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, he would be a racist for saying that. I'm a racist for saying that we're all one blood. Can you imagine that? By saying that we're all one race, that makes me racist. That's where we're at. So, in America and in the church, critical race theory, all whites are the oppressors, regardless of circumstance, effort, or history. It does not matter if you came over from Norway yesterday and moved here. You are automatically part of that class. Therefore, you should be paying reparations to descendants of slaves because you benefit from it. You just moved here yesterday. It doesn't matter. Whites have engineered society for their own benefit. And so even though it may not look like that, it's really all about just trying to keep whites in power, except for how come there are so many African Americans in all sorts of levels of society that are honored by whites oftentimes. Athletes, actors and actresses, politicians. Apparently it's not as oppressive as they claim. But CRT is racist. I like what Daryl Harrison said. He says it's a multi-layered cake with each layer having a different color, but it's frosted in the end with the same flavor of racist icing from top to bottom. That's what critical race theory is. The National Museum of African American History and Culture has this flyer, Signs of Whiteness. Okay? By the way, I think I missed the slide here. There it goes. Yeah, whiteness is what we're going to look at next. An ideology of assumed superiority created by whites used to justify the oppression of non-whites. You guys remember that class that we had when they pulled us aside in like 5th grade and they told you who are not people of color, remember, you're white and you're supposed to oppress everybody. Do you remember that in school? I don't. Because I didn't have that, and neither did you. Okay, and yet they pretend as if this is the way we've been raised. I was raised, and I praise God for this, by godly parents who told me to treat everybody the same. regardless of skin color. Because we're all made in God's image. And so from my earliest time, that's what I remember doing. Now, I know not everybody does that, and we're not perfect. But if anything, part of white culture is part of the systemic oppression and racism. All right, so what is part of white culture? Well, according to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, signs of whiteness include individualism. Because remember, you have to belong to the state. Not about individual rights. Independency. No, you have to be dependent on the state. Nuclear family. No, you have to tear down the family. That's why when you look at the Black Lives Matter website, the original website, what they had until it caused a big furor, is that they actually came right out and said that they are opposed to the nuclear family and they're all about tearing it down. That was right on their website. You can look at what's called the Wayback Machine to see what their website looked like 5 years ago before they changed it. Objective and rational thinking. That's a sign of whiteness. How racist is that? Let's say that somebody who's African American, you tell them that they think rationally, that's a sign of whiteness. You're not allowed to think rationally. Hard work is a sign of whiteness. Christianity is a sign of whiteness. Never mind the fact that it began with a bunch of Middle Eastern Jews. But apparently it's a sign of whiteness. Respecting authority is a sign of whiteness. Punctuality. In fact, this has happened earlier this week, my wife was telling me about. In Oregon, they postponed a meeting on this kind of stuff because punctuality, having it on time, is a sign of whiteness, so they had to change it. Delayed gratification. In other words, working toward a goal and saving up for it. Being competitive or competition, also a sign of whiteness. It's ridiculous. In other words, all the things that would actually make for a pretty strong society, tear them all down. You see it? Can you imagine how horrible it would be to be punctual, to work for something for a while and have a goal and not have to have instant gratification, to respect authority, to be competitive? I mean, they're just horrible things, aren't they? Here's a book called Not My Idea, which was all about talking about how whiteness is a bad deal. It always was. And it goes on and talks about how whites basically stole all land from the natives and everything. And look, we have sins as a nation. And many Native Americans were treated horribly early on. And throughout our history, that's clearly been done. But let's not pretend that they were all perfect before the Europeans arrived, and that there were never wars or fighting over land or anything else before that, because that was going on too. And it has happened throughout history. It's not just a white problem or a black problem or a brown problem. It is a human problem because human beings are sinful. That doesn't excuse maybe some of our ancestors treating people unfairly and going back on their word and other things. Here is Jarvis Williams, professor of New Testament interpretation at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, there's something going on at that school with a bunch of their professors who are caught up in this critical race theory, and they've been promoting it quite a bit. Unfortunately, this is one of the most influential schools in the nation today in terms of conservative Christianity. And yet they have several professors there who have bought this stuff hook, line, and sinker. So let me see if I can get this audio thing worked out properly. See if this works at all. Now the voice match might be a little bit off on some of these videos. It looked like it when I was doing it earlier, so here we go.
The question is, what is whiteness? Here's something that's very important to realize. Whiteness is not about your biology, it's about an ideology.
Can you hear it?
It's a biological fiction, but a social fact. So one aspect of whiteness was a way for Europeans who were different to homogenize themselves into a group known as white, to distinguish themselves from these enslaved Africans. One reason we get enslaved
it must be disappointing to look at every aspect of life through the lens of the color of a person's skin. I can't imagine living that way. And you look at a certain individual and automatically think something of them because of the color of their skin. By the way, who were the people who ended the slave trade? Anyone want to take a guess about those white evangelical Christians over in England who tried to put an end to the slave trade? Wilberforce and others? But no, they're whites who were all about whiteness so that they can enforce slavery. Were there some white people involved? Absolutely. Okay? Guess what? Who were often involved in the initial selling of slaves on the African coast? Blacks. Who sold fellow blacks into slavery. Look, slavery was abhorrent, but the United States is not alone in this sin. They treat us as if we're the only nation that did it. Brazil had more slaves than the Americas. Than the United States of America. And many of our states, it was not legal. And we fought a war to end it. So, I think it's the same thing.
Whiteness is not about your biology, it's about an ideology.
Is that the same thing?
It's a
Yeah.
biology of fiction.
I don't know why I have it on there twice. Okay. So white privilege. So now we're into white privilege. We look at whiteness, which leads to white privilege. Unearned advantages possessed by whites in a society created by and for whites. Now I'm putting whites in quotes because we're truly not white. I'm not. I mean, I don't know if you have a white piece of paper, you can hold up and see that I'm not that same color. Okay? But just for the sake of argument, we'll use white and black many times, or a person of color, or but we're not truly white. We have the same melanin, same color of skin. Whiteness was established to create and entrench white privilege. Here is what Peggy McIntosh said about her white privilege. I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. I'm not supposed to know about them. They just benefit me all the time. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Didn't you know that if you're white, you don't have to work for anything. Everything's just given to you. There was an old Saturday Night skit where, back when Eddie Murphy was on the show, where he actually dressed as a white person and painted his face in white, and then he would go into the store, like the gas, he wanted to buy like a newspaper, and the clerk just, "No, take it." And it was all kind of making fun of this idea that everything is just given to white people for free. And it was done in a humorous way. Robin DiAngelo, the woman on the left there, she might be the most racist person I've ever listened to. She wrote a book called White Fragility, and I had to listen to a 2-hour presentation she gave and write a review of it. Where she said this: when we use the term white supremacy, we are not referring to extreme hate groups or bad racists. We use the term to capture the all-encompassing dimensions of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority in mainstream society. Everything she ever talks about in her 2-hour presentation, everything is based on the color of a person's skin. And she is so smug the entire time. By the way, she's a white woman. Here's Matt Chandler. You might have heard of him before. He's a very popular pastor. And here's him addressing his white privilege.
I can go on and on here. But what happens in that kind of upbringing, which is fine, is that there were some lenses put over my eyes in which I saw the world through those lenses, not knowing what those lenses are. And so if I could kind of just be straight at what I'm talking about is that I have grown up with this invisible kind of bag of privilege, this kind of invisible toolkit that I could reach in there at any given moment and have this type of privilege that a lot of other brothers and sisters don't have, don't possess. And so if I can just kind of lay it all out there, what I'm talking about right now is white privilege. And so
All right, am I denying that there are certain individuals who have it tougher in our culture or in certain segments, certain places in our society because of the color of skin? No. There are places where that can make it more difficult. It's not always one way. Okay, and there are certain benefits that are sometimes given to others as well. Here's Tim Keller also well-known pastor from New York. He's also talking about his white privilege.
And who just moved into his community and went to his church. And at one point he heard the pastor talking about the fact that we are all complicit in creating this narrative that black people are dangerous, etc. And so we're complicit in this. Afterwards, the Norwegian government said, no, I'm Norwegian. No, it had nothing to do with it. And my pastor friend said, studies have shown and pretty much proven that if you have white skin, it's worth $1 million over a lifetime over somebody who doesn't have white skin. And that's because of historical forces that have come about. And then at this point, you could go at it several ways. One, as I mentioned, if you have that asset of white skin right now, historical asset, then you actually have to say, I didn't deserve this. And also, to some degree, I'm the product of standing on the shoulders of other people who got that through injustice. So the Bible actually says, yes, you are involved in injustice, and even if you didn't actually do it, therefore you have a responsibility, not just to say, well, maybe if I get around to it, maybe we can do something about the poor people out there. You're part of the problem.
So the Bible blames you for doing something that you didn't do? Is that really what the Bible does? I think Pastor Keller should read his Bible a little closer. Here's one professor who says white people should commit suicide as an ethical act. Now, some of these people I think are just trying to say something as absurd as possible, but actually some of these people actually do think that. Now, going back to Tim Keller's stuff, notice it always just boils down to one thing. It's just the color of the person's skin, and that's why it's worth $1 million more on average, even though that's not an accurate number. But actually, more often than not, has more to do with whether you're raised in a home that has both mother and father, or what area of the country you live in. I live in the state of Kentucky. The southeastern part of the state of Kentucky is the poorest place in the entire nation. It's almost all white. You've heard of hillbillies and everything. They're exceedingly poor in that region of southeastern Kentucky. And there's a long history as to why. But to just boil it down instantly to race, and if you're a pastor and you just automatically assign blame to a certain individual because of the color of skin, sorry, that's racist. Matthew Hall, I don't know how many of these clips we can play. I want to get through some other stuff, but same sort of stuff here. This is the provost at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary again on white supremacy. Let's listen to his real quick. I think it's only about 30 seconds, and then we'll move ahead.
I'm just going to say it. Everything that you assumed or thought was normal in the world, or everything that you thought was true about your tradition, your denomination, your own family, there's a whole, I'm going to pull the veil back and what looked like this beautiful narrative of faithfulness and orthodoxy and truth and righteousness and justice. I'm going to peel that back and I'm going to show you the rotting corpse of white supremacy that's underneath that surface. But I think it's clear.
So how do you feel about that guy calling your parents a bunch of white supremacist racists? Again, this is the guy who sets the class schedule of all the different classes they're going to have. It's one of the leading seminaries in the nation. And the seminary is headed up by somebody who is considered to be one of the great thinkers in the Christian world today, and he's the president of that seminary. How come he's not doing anything about it? Or maybe he has done a little bit, but how come he's not doing more than that? We saw Jarvis Williams earlier, so there's another thing from him. We'll skip past this one. What does the Bible say about these kind of issues? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So if you're calling somebody a racist or a white supremacist who is not, that's false witness. Okay? Brothers, do not slander one another. That's what he's doing. Okay, that's what a lot of these people are doing. What about this? Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. We're going to be held accountable for what we do, not for what our ancestors did. Okay, so if you happen to have ancestors from the South who happen to own slaves, you didn't own slaves. Okay, is it true that maybe you have inherited some wealth down the line 4 or 5 generations later that some other people didn't? Sure, that could be. But you're not guilty for that reason. So, if you want to go back to what the Bible says, it's the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Romans 14, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us shall give account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or cause to fall in our brother's way. Okay? How does it feel when you have done what you can to treat people equally, and yet have fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who are well-known pastors just call you a racist or a white supremacist? Pretty rotten, isn't it? And yet that's what's going on. Why? Because these guys want to be relevant? Because they don't want to be attacked by the media? Or they fear man rather than God? I don't know their motives. I'm just spitballing here. I don't want to assign false motives. Maybe they've been deceived into thinking this stuff is really true. But we see it in more like white fragility. Oh boy. All right. This is from Robin DeAngelo. She is a real treat. The inability to tolerate the racial stress of a challenge to our positions or perspectives. White fragility functions to block the challenge and regain white racial equilibrium. Therefore, anything part of white culture is part of systemic oppression and racism. The fact that I'm giving this talk tonight because I'm offended by some of the things they're talking about, because I disagree, shows my white fragility. I'm being defensive. There she is. Racism exists today in traditional and modern forms. I think we would acknowledge there is racism, right? It happens, and unfortunately, I think that things had gotten far better by the 1990s. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and I saw things where things were really improving in the 90s and in the early 2000s. In fact, we used to have movies, some of you will remember this, remember the Titans? Remember that movie? All about black and white coming together for a common cause, and everybody loved that movie because of the message. Now, we're teaching in our schools, we need to have segregation. We need to have safe spaces for people of a certain color. We need to segregate people. What happened? Things were getting too good for the real racists. The people who realize, oh, we're losing political clout. We're losing our ability to win elections if people are united. We need to create more division. That's what happened. All members of society have been socialized to participate in it. All white people benefit from racism regardless of intentions. Intentions are irrelevant. You are guilty. The question is not did racism take place, but rather how. Here's her book, White Fragility. Racial socialization sets us up to repeat racist behavior regardless of our intentions or self-image. Therefore, we must continue to ask how our racism manifests, not if. For as long as America exists with its current institutions, it will also need to be in group therapy where our term begins with, hi, I'm America, and I'm racist. Notice, as long as America exists with its current institutions, there's a little bit of a hint at what she's really going for. Tear it down. Though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. So, she's going to explain in this video. It's real quick, but she'll explain what she means by that. I think it's bizarre, but I think you'll understand what she's saying.
White fragility is the defensiveness, the argumentation, the hurt feelings, the withdrawal that often erupts whenever white people are challenged on their racial worldviews. The fragility part is meant to capture how little it takes to cause white people to erupt in defensiveness, but the impact of that defensiveness, however, is not fragile at all. It functions as a kind of everyday white racial control by making it so difficult for people to challenge us on our unaware assumptions and biases that most of the time they don't. And so everybody in their place and protect the racial hierarchy.
Well, it's a good thing that Robert DiAngelo is so woke and can alert us to these things so that we know what we're doing wrong, right? Now, if you watch her presentation for 2 hours, you'll be astonished at how racist a person can be. Every single thing she says is seen through the lens of color, and it is obnoxious. If you grew up in the country, sorry people, you can't say that you were sheltered from racist ideas because you didn't really have to have a lot of interaction that way. Because it meant you were probably raised by conservative people who were actually more racist than most people. She comes right up and says almost that thing word for word. But then if you happen to grow up in a city where you're interacting with a lot of people and somebody accuses you as a white person of being racist, you say, no, I have a lot of black friends. That's racist too. So if you don't have them, you're racist. If you do have them, you're racist. No matter what you do or don't do, you're racist. Everything she does is through the lens of color, and it is obnoxious. Then there is anti-racism. That sounds good, right? We want to be against racism. That's not what anti-racism means. Ibram X. Kendi is the one who wrote this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It does not mean against racism. He refers to it as standing against policies that promote racist power. That is, any policy that results in inequity of outcome must be racist. So in other words, if you change the law in Boscoville, so the speed limit going through town is now 28.5 miles per hour or something like that. And you had, let's say the city was a little more diverse, and let's say that 10% of the people that got pulled over were African American, and 9% of the people that got pulled over were white. That is a racist law. That's what he's saying. Fundamentally, racism, its heartbeat has always been denial. And the sound of that heartbeat has always been, I'm not racist. To be more specific, the sound of that heartbeat is not racist. In other words, he thinks that is the worst thing anybody can say is that I'm not a racist. Because you automatically are. And if there's a disparity between racial groups, it must be because of racist power and policy, not because of what people have actually done. There was a documentary that was made a couple of years ago that was very, it was strongly promoted by all the different streaming services and everything, especially Netflix. That's what it was on. I don't know if the other ones had it or not, but by Netflix for sure. Called 13th. Did anybody watch that? I had 2 friends recommend it to me. They had both bought into it, and I watched it and ended up writing 4,000 words in response to it. It was all about the 13th Amendment, and they had pulled a phrase out of there saying that it was actually written because once slavery came to an end, it was actually written so that blacks could be mistreated and more of them would be incarcerated. And that was the whole spin on it, which is not at all what the 13th Amendment was about. But that's what they were pushing, and they kept going back to the crime bill passed by Bill Clinton, or signed by Bill Clinton, passed by the Congress, who happened to be a Democrat, right? And as a result of that, like you heard of the 3 strikes and you're out policy, that's what that was, 3 strikes. So if you're guilty of violent crimes, 3 violent crimes, you're out. Throw away the key, basically. And then they suddenly just shift and talk about drugs. And more blacks are in prison because of drugs than whites. And therefore, this thing is a racist law. It's like, wait. It was about violent crimes. What does it matter? They twist the story all the time to fit their ends, or to fit their goal. And the whole documentary was like that, where they would bring up one little thing and then completely twist what it was talking about and try to make it seem as racist as possible. Never once in almost 2 hours of film did they ever ask, did that person break the law? And were they treated fairly by the legal system? That's what would be justice, right? If they broke the law, they were treated fairly, then it's just. Now, you can debate whether or not laws, the penalties for certain drug violations and everything were too harsh or are too harsh. That's a debate that can be had. But the question that they should have been asking is, did they break the law and were they treated fairly? And those questions are never asked. We as Americans have been taught that if you have racial inequity, if you have racial disparity, there must be something wrong with the people on the lower end. Is that what you've been taught? That there's something morally inferior about those people, that they're not as much of a person? That's what he says in his presentation. What an awful thing. Since when did we become like the Hindus with the caste system? Because that's how he views things. I don't view somebody who has less than me as being inferior to me. Just like I don't view somebody who has more than me as being inferior. I view them all as people who are made in the image of God. And that's where I start from, but they don't. Because for them, as Marxists, they don't start with God. So they start with, it's all about economics and power. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Racism itself is institutional, structural, and systemic. So let's look at social justice real quickly. It encompasses all of these different critical theories. By the way, mostly we've just been talking about critical race theory. We didn't even get to the other ones at all, but it applies the same thing to gender. And so you can do the same thing with how women are being mistreated by men. Everything that they've been saying about race, they do the same thing with gender. They do the same thing with what they call queer theory. They do the same thing with sexual orientation. They do it with all of these different things, and just apply the exact same thing. It's oppressor versus oppressed. Why? To create as much conflict and division as possible. Ultimately, these ideas are all about tearing down the Judeo-Christian foundation of the nation. So social justice warriors love to quote biblical passages in caring about the poor. Because there are verses that talk about caring about the poor, right? Quite a few of them. Where does it ever say, force your government to take stuff from other people to make sure that the poor are cared for? Anybody have a chapter and verse? You don't. Are individuals commanded to care for the poor? Yeah. And as Christians in America, historically, have Christians done a good job of caring for the poor? Well, far more generous than non-Christians. And it's not even close. It is, you know what, it's actually unjust. So they call this social justice. It's actually unjust to take from those who have worked for something and give those who refuse to work. Okay, keyword, refuse. Don't replace that with the word can't. There are some people who cannot work. And in those cases, the church should be willing to step in and take care of them. Okay? And in this nation, we have safety nets put in place from the government that actually will help take care of people. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we have some of those things in place. But God is the one who defines justice. It exists because He is a just God. He is the source of morality. And we recognize something as just or unjust because we're made in His image. Injustice is not just some people are poorer than others. Some people didn't get as good of a grade on a test as others. Some people didn't have as good of an upbringing as others. That's not injustice. Injustice exists because people are sinners. So critical social justice, which we've been talking about really, is the state redistribution through power in politics. That's what they're all about. It's all about the state stepping in. It's Marxist. It's about the state taking over. That's why we started with the first 15 minutes about Marxism, because it all goes back to that. Biblical justice is a law of God, and it's a heart issue. So, does the Bible endorse social justice? Well, not the way they talk about. Here's the verse I asked my friend if he had it in a book at all. You'll see why I asked this question. For even when we were with you, Paul is telling the Thessalonians, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. What do you think that does to social justice the way it's fun in our day? Why do you think he didn't like me asking that question? For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such, we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. Notice it doesn't say who cannot eat. Paul already made provision, and the church had already made provision way back in Acts 6 for like the widows who weren't able to work. They were provided for. Paul later on talks about widows who are of a certain age. If they're younger, hey, let them bring if they're old, this thing. Take care of them. So that's already been part of the church from the beginning. But if a person refuses to work, they don't eat. If a person doesn't take care of his family, he's worse than an unbeliever. That's what the Bible talks about. By the way, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a man. But those things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. What makes us sinful is what comes out of here, not the color of our skin, not whether we're male or female. It's what comes out of here. So then the whole idea of wokeness, you've heard this, right? This is when somebody awakens to all of these realities, and they recognize that they've been the beneficiary of all of this racist stuff, and they want to do something about it. So when a person awakens to their oppressive ways of living and thinking, and they have two options. They can either sit back and do nothing and allow the new voices to take over, okay, which means let the people who that they consider to be oppressed, whether that is minorities, whether that is female, whether that is LGBTQ, whatever it is, allow them to take over and throw their voices in, or they join the mob to overthrow Judeo-Christian morality, free market, capitalism economies, and the freedoms of expression, speech, and the press. So, CRT is anti-gospel. It adds works to the gospel and subtracts from the power of the gospel. Owen Strand, in his book Christianity and Wokeness, one of the books we had to read for class. By the way, for the most part, a really good book. It seems like it was rushed together because there were several editorial errors that should have easily been caught. And then I've got one theological issue where I think he undermined his whole case. But for the most part, what he's doing when he's defining wokeness is he does a really good job with it. As a system, we conclude that wokeness both adds to and subtracts from the gospel. There is more that must be done for white people than the simple gospel does. Thus, it is finished is not technically correct. Wokeness would have us correct Jesus in his dying breath at Calvary. There is more for sinners to do than just believe and repent. So wokeness adds to the gospel. But it also subtracts. It takes away from the transforming power that is in the blood of Christ. The end result is a gospel that is thoroughly unlike the biblical gospel. Stronger still, the end result is a gospel that is anti-gospel. And he's exactly right. That's what this wokeness, that's what critical race theory and all these other things do. In order for you to, salvation is achieved by recognizing your privilege and by allowing others to take over, or by joining the mob. It's fighting against racism. That's how you're going to achieve your salvation. Now, what does the Bible say? We're all sinful and we need a Savior. So the people who are focused on these things have lost sight of the gospel message. I'm not saying some of the Christians, some of the people that we watched earlier, some of these professors, I'm not saying that they're not Christians, but they bought into this ideology for one reason or another, and it's nonsense. Are there problems in our culture? Yes. Are there people who treat other people unfairly? Yes. Okay. Is it all going to be solved by saying, hey, let's just get along? No. But is it going to be solved by constantly dredging up America's sins of the past? How many times do we have to acknowledge that slavery was horrible before we can move on? Oh yeah, remember we were moving beyond back in the 1980s and 1990s and in the 2000s, but then they realized, yeah, we're getting too far from that. We need to bring that back. We need to create more division. So the solution to all of this ultimately is the gospel message. It is what Christ did. He died on the cross for our sins, whether that happens to be racism, whether that happens to be prejudice of any kind, in any way, shape, or form, or if it's just greed, or if it's lust, or pride, or whatever it is, we're all sinful. Not because of the color of your skin. Okay? People from any shade of brown, which is what we all are, have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And there's one solution to all of that, and that is the Son of God shedding his blood on the cross for our sins and then rising from the dead 3 days later. And we're told that we're supposed to, as much as possible with us, live at peace with those around us, right? We should be striving to do that. Paul told the Romans that. But the woke crowd does not want peace. They want division. They want strife. They want to stir up anger. They want to stir up hatred because they want a revolution. That's what it's about. That's why you see lawlessness in the streets. That's why you see these things, and you see mayors and governors who don't do anything about it because that's what they want. So if you're confused by what's been going on, that's exactly what's been going on. It's part of the plan. And for far too long, Christians didn't recognize it, and we kept sending our kids off to school, to universities who've been preaching this stuff for the last 60 to 70 years. And then they come out as good little Marxists. Or as some people call them, and this might sound a little mean, but I think it's very effective, it's very accurate, useful idiots. They don't know what to talk. They're idealistic. It wouldn't be awesome if everybody got the same. Well, it would be great if everybody was lifted out of poverty. That would be wonderful. But poor you always have to be, right? So I'm not saying that that's a good thing that there are poor people, because we should be providing for them as much as possible. But don't use that as a way to deny the gospel message and shift the gospel to be about something else. So, all right, well, I'm done with that soapbox. I mean, there's so much more to that presentation that I could have added if I had more time today. That was, I hope that flowed logically, because this is the first time I've ever given it, and I just got to that last slide by like 4:30 in the hotel. So if it didn't make sense, please tell me, and I'll try to fix some things. I did notice a typo, but I won't tell you where. All right. Kids are up yet, so any questions, comments? Anybody want to show off your white privilege by being the first to ask a question? Think rationally. I'm going to call you out on it now, because if you ask a question, you're obviously a white supremacist, right?
So for the last couple of weeks, I've been hearing that critical theory type stuff, and I've kind of wanted to know more about what it was. I wish I didn't know that much now. Holy cow.
I can point you to some books and you can find out what you want.
That makes me tired.
I'll tell you what, I'm very tired of reading the books about it. There's another one that I don't remember if I quoted it or not. Vodi Bakum has a book called Fault Lines, which is really good on this topic. One of the things that's helpful is, obviously, if you know who Vodi Bakum is, he's an African-American man who actually bought into a lot of the, as a young man, at college age, he bought into a lot of the black supremacy stuff, and then got saved, and can see a lot of the stuff coming through there. So he does a really good job critiquing a lot of these things. So that Fault Lines is a good book to read on that. The last one I quoted, or the last one I showed you by Owen Strand, I thought, like I said, I thought he did a really good job. There were several little editorial errors that they should have caught that they didn't, but I think they were just rushing to use the print. But the way that here's what he did, and this is what was disappointing. The whole book was about how we shouldn't be blamed for what our ancestors did, right? Correct? I mean, we shouldn't be, if you happen to have a slave, a great-great-great-grandpa who owned slaves, you're not guilty of that. And yet, because of his theology, because he's a very strong Calvinist, his whole second half of the book, when he's talking about the theology of the Bible, and with this, is we are all guilty for Adam's sin. Okay? We can't be blamed for what our ancestors did, but we can be blamed for what our great ancestor did. He just undermined his entire case. If he didn't have that angle on it, yes, we die because of what Adam did, but we are not judged because of what Adam did. People are going to be judged according to their own words, not what Adam did. Make sense? So he kind of undermined his case, unfortunately. But Earl, are you ready to come in?
They're not there yet, but they will be in probably 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm done. We're doing Q&A at this point,
Okay.
so I'm just babbling, whatever it is. You have a question?
Where did they come up with the phrase critical theory?
What's that?
Critical theory. How do they get critical theory?
Oh, so critical is not about critical thinking, it's about criticizing what was there. And so the whole critical theory going back to like the Frankfurt School and Gramsci, those guys back in the 1920s, 1930s, so it's basically taking Marxism and trying to figure out a different way to implement it. Nice when Earl interrupts the guy that I'm talking to.
I didn't notice that.
That's okay. He wasn't listening to me anyway, so. All right. Anyone else?
Well, you know, this was a real thing just about less than 2 years ago, USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, they had a thing and was trying to go through Congress and all that, and but finally they're going to do it. If you were an African-American farmer who had a loan to USDA, it was going to be forgiven 110%.
So you actually would
Actually, they're going to
money.
give you back the loan plus. And there was a group of people who got together and filed an anti-discrimination lawsuit. And I think it pretty much did put a stop to it. But they were going to, just because you were black and trying to disadvantage, you were going to get 110%. I actually seen the, what read.
And there have been certain things, especially grants or loans for schools, certain things for college that have benefited minorities for years. They were eligible for more things than what whites have been. That's been going on for 40, 50 years in our nation. And to say that it's always skewed the other way is false. There are times where it's a benefit. You have Harvard that has been extremely discriminatory toward Asians because what they want is like a reflection of what it is in society. If you have like 55% white, 16% black, and 12% Asian. Well, the people who qualify to get in, it's like 30 to 40% Asian. They actually limit the number down to like the 10 to 15%. And so a whole bunch of Asians are turned away from going to Harvard even though they qualify more than the people who are getting in. And so there was a lawsuit and it went to the Supreme Court before the current Supreme Court and it was overthrown or overruled. So it was not upheld, so Harvard can continue to be discriminatory. So it's crazy. But there's somebody else back there. Yeah.
I guess what's your opinion on how much more of a foothold these theories and stuff like this take in society?
How much more of a football what?
Like the critical race theory and stuff, you say it's been around for years, it's gotten like really out there over this last year and stuff, or at least more publicized, I guess.
It really exploded with the election of President Trump. That's when you started to hear everybody's white supremacist. It's like, wait a minute, I've never met a white supremacist, but we're all being called that because they wanted to be able to paint him as evil as possible. And I'm not saying at all about pro-Trump or anti-Trump. This stuff has been going on before him, but that was like the thing that really threw it into the public square. And it's like full speed ahead, and there's no turning back with these guys. So if we can't teach people the truth about who we are and what our nation was truly founded on, we're in a lot of trouble because of where it's going. And this is the same sort of thing that happened in other countries in Marxism. They've always pitted one group against another. And it's usually the young people who head off to university against the people that have gone before and have laid that foundation. And it's the same thing today. So as long as we continue to send them through our universities, it's going to continue to teach us what we're paid for by the state. We're going to have big problems.
And you've seen it a lot also with COVID, and things were put in place to guard against or protect against it. A lot of it just made absolutely no sense, but yet it was like the driving force.
It's about controlling. And it's about the state having authority over what you can or can't do, which is what these people are all in favor of. All right, well, they're ready to come in, I think. So
some will kind of backfire though because parents started seeing what their kids are being brought at home.
Yep.
That's why it also started showing.
It had backfired in many places, but it will continue to backfire in the rest of the places. All right, thanks guys.